Hi guys, welcome to the next video lesson, this time on the theme of class in an inspector calls. Before I go on, the usual reminder that there are many more video lessons over on mrhonline.co.uk, so Mr. H is me, on a variety of themes, plot, character, structure, setting, poetry, across all the different exam boards that you may be studying. Okay, so let's crack on with class in an inspector calls. So class, what's the definition of class before we continue? We need to know what we're talking about. System of ordering society whereby people are divided into sets based on perceived social or economic status. Typically, at the time this was set, there were three classes: the upper class, middle class, and the working class or lower classes. All the characters bar Edna the maid are either the rich, upwardly mobile Birlings or the upper class Gerald Croft. Priestley explores issues of class through how each of the main characters view and interact with members of the lower classes, in particular Eva Smith. He is also trying to show how the easy lives led by the upper classes relies exclusively on the hard work of the lower classes. So Birling may want to dismiss the girls who work in his factory, but he's completely reliant upon their hard work for his profit. Okay, so remember, you can pause screen whenever you like, take notes. I'm going to look at these areas when considering the theme of class. So the character's attitudes towards Eva in particular. Okay, does the inspector have any impact on these attitudes? So how do they behave towards her over the previous 18 months and after the inspector's interrogation? Have they accepted or acknowledged any wrongdoing on their part at all? Okay, and it varies. Context. So explore the class system as it was in 1912 and 1945. So I've got a screen that will highlight the different contextual background or environment that existed in 1912 and how it had changed by 1945 after the two world wars. What were Priestley's views? Remember, he's a socialist, and he believed in spreading the wealth amongst the majority of people, not just having private ownership. What are Priestley's views on the upper classes' treatment of the lower classes, and how do these manifest themselves throughout the play? Basically, primarily through the character of the inspector, and less so, but also Sheila. Consequences. Are there any consequences for how far the lower classes are treated, for how the lower classes are treated? And what is the final warning delivered by the inspector? I think that should read. Okay, we'll have a look at that. So remember the millions and millions and millions, and if you don't change your ways, in fire and blood and anguish you will suffer. And how do the audience respond to the characters and their different attitudes? So which characters do you think Priestley wishes us to like and identify with? And which are we supposed to dislike? And what do you think is the reason behind this? Okay. So, again, the play was written in 1945, but it was set in 1912. What was life like in 1912? Well, in 1912, the First World War would start in 2 years. So Birling's optimistic view that there would not be a war is completely wrong. And Birling, remember, represents the upper classes and capitalism. By 1945, the Second World War had ended, but people were recovering from nearly 6 years of warfare, danger, and uncertainty. In 1912, there were strong distinctions between the upper and the lower classes. But by 1945, because of the two world wars, class distinctions had been greatly reduced. In 1912, women were subservient to men. All a well-off woman could do was get married, and a poor woman was seen merely as cheap labour. By 1945, as a result of the wars, women had earned a more valued place in society because of their war efforts as well. Back in 1912, the ruling classes, for obvious reasons, saw no need to change the status quo. They were quite happy to keep things as they were. But by 1945, there was a great desire in the general public for social change. Immediately after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's Labour Party won a landslide victory over Winston Churchill and the Conservatives, when you would have imagined that the Conservatives' popularity would have been at an all-time high, having won the war, but that wasn't the case. Priestley deliberately set his play 1912 because the date represented an era when all was very different from the time he was writing. In 1912, rigid class and gender boundaries seemed to ensure that nothing would change. Yet by 1945, and after having endured two world wars, Most of those class and gender divisions had been breached. Priestley wanted to make the most of these changes. Through this play, he encourages people to seize the opportunity the end of the war had given them to build a better, more caring society. Using the treatment of Eva as a starting point, Priestley wished to illustrate how the working classes should be valued far more by the upper classes. The gap between the two was too large, creating a grossly unfair society where the majority of the wealth was controlled by the ruling minority. He wished for a fairer distribution of wealth, but saw the class system as an obstacle to achieving this outcome. Okay, so pause the screen, take some notes. Great for your context and the background. Okay, so setting: the Birlings and Gerald Croft in 1945. Mr. Birling has advanced himself socially through his marriage to Mrs. Birling. Remember, in the opening stage directions, we learned that Sybil Birling is her husband's social superior. Gerald, in a similar way to Mrs. Birling, is marrying beneath him, as the Crofts are a wealthier, older family than the Birlings, and Sir and Lady Croft are Gerald's parents. It's worth noting that his parents, Lord and Lady Croft, are absent from their son's engagement celebration. Why might this be? I remember... I'll carry on. Mr. Birling frequently tries to assert his own status. He was previously Mayor of Brumley and name drops influential friends in attempts to impress the family but intimidate the inspector as well. He hopes to be included on the next honours list so that he can be knighted, and he confides this to Gerald in the hope it will appease and impress Gerald's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Birling both take offence at the inspector's methods and tone, believing that they should be treated with more respect, implying they perceive themselves as superior to the inspector and perhaps the law because of their status within society. Sheila's pride causes her to have Eva Smith sacked after she was merely jealous of her. Her pride was wounded when the dress suited Eva far more than it did her, and she didn't hesitate in abusing her power to punish the innocent Eva Smith, just because she could. Remember, she threatened to remove her family's custom from the upper class or the upmarket clothes store Millwards unless Eva Smith was sacked. Eva's crime? To look better in a dress than she did. Scandal is revealed in terms of Gerald's relationship with Daisy and Eva. It was seen as inappropriate for a man of his class to marry a woman from the lower classes, so the relationship would never have become serious for him, and once he was bored by it, he simply paid her off, demonstrating how he views the lower classes as objects to use for his entertainment, and revealing a bit about his attitude towards women as well, both his fiancée Sheila and Eva Smith, or Daisy Renting as she was known to him. So the inspector, remember, the inspector is Priestley's mouthpiece on stage. He represents the voice of the millions and millions and millions of lower class people who are suffering as a consequence of the negligent and selfish acts of the powerful, rich and wealthy upper classes. That millions and millions and millions quotation comes from the inspector's final speech, his delivery to the family, but also to the audience, that we need to change our ways if we want a fairer society for all. How does the inspector influence the attitude of the main characters? Well, it can be broadly divided into generational aspects. The younger Birlings acknowledge that the attitude their father displays towards his workers is poor and needs to change. They offer hope that the future will be a fairer place for all. Whereas we are left with the impression that the older Birlings and Gerald, to an extent, not to an extent, and Gerald, end up playing exactly the same positions in which they started. They have learned nothing. They simply represent outdated and obsolete views on how society should work, which is why Priestley has the final act of the play being a telephone call from another inspector coming to inspect the family, giving them another chance perhaps to acknowledge their role in the suicide of Eva Smith. Okay, so I hope you can read this, pause it again, make a note, some useful quotations that you can focus on. So opening stage directions: large suburban house reflecting the wealth of the Birlings. All five are in evening dress of the period, again signs of wealth and status. Now as I sat around the table, Arthur merely wants to compliment the cook. Remember, Arthur is rather provincial in his speech, so he's not from the ruling classes. He's from maybe a lower class, a more rural background, and has worked his way up as a successful manufacturer. And in front of Gerald, who is from the upper classes, he wants to compliment the cook. Now, that's etiquette gone wrong. It's crazy. And his wife, points this out to him. Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things. In other words, you don't acknowledge the help at all. Okay, so she's admonishing her husband for publicly complimenting the cook for the lovely food in front of Gerald. So another reflection on the upper class's attitude towards those who work for them. Now, Sheila doesn't kowtow to her parents' attitudes towards the lower classes, and she insists, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. So she's shocked at her father's attitude to his workers, hinting that there is hope for the future. The younger generation maybe won't be as callous as the older generation. But, you know, Sheila had to learn her lesson the hard way. And so she had, and I'd persuade Mother to close our account with them. This is her demonstrating that her power of her position over the lower classes and not giving it a second thought until it was pointed out to her by the inspector. Eric, commenting on his relationship with Eva Smith and how he abused his position. I didn't feel about her as she felt about me. So, his mother, a girl of that class, Mrs. Birling revealing her prejudicial attitude towards the lower classes. She looks down on them. She believes that from the lower classes you are of a lower moral fibre. So the inspector highlighting the contrast between the comfort of the Birlings and Eva Smith. So Eva Smith's condition or predicament: no work, no money coming in, and living in lodgings with no relatives to help her. Lonely, half-starved, she was feeling desperate and so felt she had to turn to prostitution as a way to make money, any money. Okay, so that covers most of class, and again there's a lot there, so pause and take notes. Now, how could you incorporate this into an exam question? Well, any exam question that comes up on the Birlings, the inspector and his attitude towards the class, and what he reveals about the Birlings' attitude towards the lower classes is significant. Priestley's belief in social responsibility, the inspector pushing that belief further and challenging the Birlings' or Arthur's and Sybil's selfish attitudes primarily. The generation gap, the differing attitudes by the end of the play to how the upper classes should treat the lower classes. And a combination of all of those things, the intentions of Priestley and his use of the inspector. Okay, so that covers class. Do check in with all the other videos and see you there.